so I'll go ahead and introduce our moderator for this webinar. So our moderator is Cruz Chan. She is the clinical manager for the Healing for Asians program at Richmond Area Multi-Services and is also a trainer for the Lotus project. So as a clinical manager, Cruz develops and manages the RAM's Healing for Asians program, which provides trauma-informed mental health services to limited English-speaking Asian victims of crime. And Cruz is also a licensed marriage and family therapist and registered drama therapist. So I will go ahead and let Cruz take it away.
Thank you, Ellen. Welcome again to our Suicide Prevention and Intervention for Asian American and Asian Immigrant Youth webinar series. As Ellen already mentioned about, this is our last webinar of the series, and today we will focus on caring for youth and families impacted by suicide. For those who missed our first two webinars, we have actually uploaded our recording and also the slide on our Lotus project website. Please feel free to check it out. This is a 90-minute webinar without intermission. We will have 3 presentations back to back and then 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A after all 3 presentations. We still encourage you to type your questions in the Q&A chat box during the presentation. And also you can vote. You can identify the questions to either or all speakers if you want a specific speaker to answer your question. And your questions will be asked by me to the speakers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that today's webinar includes discussions and personal stories related to suicide prevention and intervention. We also recognize that this content may be emotionally activating or resonate with your personal or professional experiences. We encourage you to take care of yourself in whatever way you need throughout the section. If at any point you need to step out, take a moment, or seek support from our team, please know that you are welcome to do so. Okay, without further ado, please allow me to introduce our first speaker, Michelle Carrillo. She is the founder and president of Arielle's Light, a nonprofit organization dedicated to increasing access to mental health support for youth and young adults. After losing her daughter Arielle to suicide, she is passionate about creating compassionate spaces where survivors feel seen, supported, and understood. In Michelle's presentation, she will be sharing how she transformed her grief into a mission to help other families find hope, healing, and connection from both her personal journey and advocacy work. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. It truly is an honor to speak with all of you, even though I can't see everyone. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge everyone joining us today, whether you're a therapist, social worker, school counselor, educator, researcher, or community advocate. You've chosen a profession that asks you to walk alongside people during some of their hardest moments of their lives. So thank you for the compassion you bring to that work. And I just realized I'm not sharing my screen, so hold on one second. Okay, here we go. All right. So today I'm not speaking to you as a researcher or clinician. I'm here as a mother. And so I'm going to apologize because I get really emotional. I'm here because on November 5th, 2024, my daughter Arielle died by suicide. And for a long time after her death, I wondered if there could ever be meaning in something so devastating. And I eventually realized that while I could never change what happened, I could choose what I did with this grief. And that choice became Arielle's Light. So today isn't about reliving the tragedy. It really is about what happens after the tragedy. It's about healing, connection, community, and hope. And my hope is that when we finish today, You'll all leave not only with a better understanding of what survivors experience, but also with a renewed confidence that the way you show up for families really truly matters. Now, before I tell you about losing Arielle, I want you to meet her. Okay. So this is my daughter, Arielle. She absolutely loved to dance. Dancing wasn't just something she did, it was a part of who she was. She felt most alive, when she was performing. She loved to laugh, loved spending time with her friends, and had this beautiful ability to make people feel welcome. She was adventurous, funny, incredibly loving, and fiercely protective of the people she cared about. She was also a daughter, a sister, a granddaughter, a cousin, and someone's best friend. And one of the things I've learned after losing her is that when someone dies by suicide, people often become defined by the way they died. Suddenly, they're introduced as the girl or the young woman who died by suicide. But that's not who she was. She had 21 beautiful years filled with joy, love, accomplishments, struggles, friendships, and dreams. One of the greatest gifts you can give survivors is to continue talking about the person that they lost. So please don't be afraid to say their name. You're not reminding us that they died. We think about them every single day. And instead, you're reminding us that they lived and that they mattered and that they continue to matter. Now, I know many of you came today to learn about suicide loss, but if you leave today remembering only one thing, I hope it's this, that before Arielle was my loss, she was my greatest joy. And she brought so much love, laughter, and light into my life as everyone else's. And while the way she died will always be part of her story, it will never define the whole of who she was. And that is why I want to begin with her life and not her death. And because she was my greatest joy, losing her became the journey no parent expects to take. Losing her shattered my world in ways I never imagined possible. Overnight, I became part of this community I never knew existed, a community of suicide loss survivors, specifically parents who lost their children. And in those first few weeks, I was simply trying to survive each day. Family and friends surrounded us with love. The meals arrived, the flowers arrived, cards arrived, money arrived, and all these blessings arrived, which was so, I'm so grateful for that. But after a few weeks, maybe a month, something changed. The life around us slowly returned to normal. People went back to work. The holidays came and went. The first holiday was horrible. Um, but the world kept on moving. But my grief didn't. It was at a standstill. So that was when I realized that there really isn't a roadmap for surviving suicide loss. I wasn't just grieving my daughter. I was trying to figure out how to live in a world where she no longer exists physically. And that realization changed everything for me. It also opened my eyes to how much support survivors truly need, not just immediately after loss, but months and years later. So most people think that grief is just simply sadness. Suicide loss is much more complicated than sadness. It brings guilt, it brings shame, it brings fear, it brings anger, confusion, isolation, and all of those things in one at the same time sometimes. And some days you don't even know the difference between the two. And the fact that I'm actually defining all five or six of those things is, pretty good. So, also, every survivor I've met asks some version of the same questions. We ask why, what did I miss? Could I have done something differently? Those questions become constant companions in my life. And perhaps one of the hardest lessons I've learned is that that many is that many of those questions will never have answers. And healing isn't about finding those answers, it's about learning how to continue living while carrying unanswered questions with grace. It's learning that two things can coexist at the same time. One is I can carry this profound grief, and the other coin is that I still find moments of joy. And that took me a very long time to believe. And people often ask me, how did you survive? It's not how did I survive or how I am surviving. And the honest answer is, I just didn't do this alone. There's a lot of things that helped me in my journey. Therapy was one. Therapy gave me a safe place to process my emotions without feeling like I had to protect anyone else's. And support groups reminded me that I wasn't the only parent asking these impossible questions. I did join Little Tokyo Service Center's grief group, and that helped me tremendously to connect with other humans that were going through the same thing as I was. Exercise and movement also helped me reconnect with my body after trauma. I didn't realize that after a trauma like this, it does something physically to your body. So I felt for me, like exercise and just movement, period, helped me. And I had to learn that self-care wasn't selfish. It was actually necessary for my survival. And I'm going to repeat that again, guys. Like self-care wasn't selfish. It was actually necessary. So also, my friends became my lifeline. I always had the five people that I could call any time of the day, no matter what. And they literally became my lifeline. Not because they always knew what to say, but because they stayed. They continued the calling after everyone left, and they continued the checking in. They remembered Arielle's birthday. They would say her name to me, and they allowed me to cry without trying to fix me. And eventually, purpose became part of my healing. Ariel's light gave my grief somewhere to go. I transmuted a lot of my grief into the start of this organization. So I didn't erase my pain, but I transformed this pain into service. And I want to share something that I hope takes a little pressure off of all of us is that you don't have to fix survivors. In fact, you can't. We don't have the perfect words for any situation. We just need people who aren't afraid to stay present. And one of the most meaningful, excuse me, one of the most meaningful things someone ever said to me was, Michelle, I don't know what to say, but I love you and I'm not going anywhere. And those words meant everything to me. That was better than any advice anyone could have given to me. So presence is healing, listening without interruption is healing, and remembering is healing. So sometimes the greatest gift you can offer another human being is simply your willingness to sit beside them in their pain. And one of the reasons I accepted this invitation to speak to everyone today is because silence can be incredibly harmful after suicide loss. I figured if I tell more of my story, there's someone else out there that can relate or maybe is going through the same thing. And, again, connection is key here. And I know that this webinar is focused on supporting Asian American, Asian immigrant youth and families. And while every family and culture is unique, many communities experience stigma around mental health and suicide. Sometimes families avoid talking because they're trying to protect one another. Sometimes they fear judgment, and sometimes they believe that silence is strength. I grew up in that household, but I've learned that silence often increases the suffering. The healing begins when someone feels safe enough to say, I am struggling. Okay. And healing grows when another person responds with compassion instead of judgment. And every one of us has the ability to create that kind of safe space. So I often think about, what every young person deserves, not just those in crisis. Every young person deserves at least one safe adult or, just one trusted relationship, okay? It could be someone who notices when they're struggling, someone who asks twice when they say that they're fine, or someone who does make it, or, who makes it okay to ask for help. I don't know what would have changed Ariel's story, um, but I've had to make peace with the fact that I may never know. I also know that connection is one of the strongest protective factors that we can offer. And sometimes being seen can change everything. Um, People always ask me or often ask me why I started Ariel's Light. And the answer is because I can't change her story. What happened is what happened. But maybe I could help change someone else's story. One question stays with me every day, though. Um, what if there was one more conversation? What if there was one more therapy session? What if there was one more trusted adult in her life? Could that have made a difference? I don't know. And I guess, I'll never know if that would have changed anything or the outcome. But I do know that too many families face barriers when trying to access mental health care. Therapy can be expensive. As we all know, wait lists can be very long. I think I'm preaching to the choir here, but finding the right therapist can be also overwhelming. I went through my own journey of that, and it took me five different therapists to find someone that I truly connected with. And I'm a grown woman and I can advocate for myself, and I can't imagine what a young person has to go through in order to advocate for themselves. Um, so this finding the right therapist can be overwhelming. Also, the stigma often keeps family from reaching out until a crisis has already developed. And at that point, I don't want to say it's too late, but you're close to that breaking point? So Ariel's Light really exists to remove those barriers. We want to streamline that whole process. We help fund therapy because, healing shouldn't depend on what someone can afford. We work to reduce the stigma surrounding it. We talk about, suicide straight on, um, because asking for help should never be seen as a weakness. And we build community because no one should have to navigate this grief alone, or any kind of mental health challenges alone. So prevention doesn't begin at the moment of crisis. Like I said before, at that point, you know, maybe I don't want to say too late, but you're already at that point. The prevention really begins with a connection, compassion, and making support available before someone reaches their breaking point. So, one of the most important lessons I've learned is that how we care for survivors is also a form of suicide prevention. When someone dies by suicide, the impact doesn't end with that one life. It ripples through parents, it ripples through siblings, it ripples through friends, classmates, coworkers, and entire communities. I can go on and on about that. But survivors like myself are at an increased risk for depression, anxiety, complicated grief, and even suicidal thoughts. I mean, I admit that I've had that in the past several times. And, that means that this postvention isn't simply about helping people cope with the loss, it's about protecting the people who are left behind. So, excuse me, every time we provide support, every time we normalize this grief, every time we connect someone with therapy or just someone in general, every time we remind a survivor they're not alone, we are helping reduce the risk of further suffering. And how we respond after suicide has the potential to influence the healing of an entire family and perhaps even future generations. And so people ask me, actually all the time, people ask me if I'm healed. And my answer that, healing isn't really a destination, it's a process. And it's something I continue to choose every day. You have to choose to be happy. or, to experience joy. I shouldn't say happiness, but like to experience joy. I still miss my daughter every single day, and I still wish she were here. I still imagine the life that she would be living. I still imagine her being part of her friends' weddings. Recently a lot of her friends have been getting engaged or getting married, and I still imagine that life for her. But today, alongside that grief, I know that there's always hope for someone else and that there is purpose. There's always connection, there's compassion, and there's always community available. So that's what from lost to light means to me. It doesn't mean that this darkness has disappeared. It's still always with me. It means that I learned that even in this darkness, light can still exist. And Arielle's light didn't end the day she died. And in fact, it shines through every young person who receives therapy or receives help, every family that finds support, and every conversation that helps reduce stigma. Her story continues through all of us, through all the work that we're doing. So, what can we do today? Um, excuse me. I'd like to leave everyone, just with a challenge. As providers, educators, clinicians, advocates, you have more influence than you may even realize. Never underestimate the impact of one conversation. Talk openly about mental health. I know that's what we all do, but this is an extra challenge to do it even more. Help families understand that asking for support is a sign of strength and not weakness. Um, Continue checking in long after everyone else has stopped. Remember the birthdays, remember anniversaries. Say the names of the people who have died. We need to create spaces where young people know they can speak honestly without fear of judgment, and continue advocating for greater access to mental health care. Because honestly, every conversation matters, every connection matters, and every act of kindness matters. And that's how we move from this loss to this light. So, with that, I'd like to close by thanking each of you, not only for listening to my story, but for the work that you do every day. If there's one thing I hope you remember after today, it's this. The survivors don't need perfection or answers. They just need presence and they need compassion. I keep on saying that over and over again. And they need people willing to stay. Ariel's life was only 21 years, but her impact continues every single day through our organization. Every, every therapy session that we help fund, every family we support, every young person who realizes they're not alone, that is Arielle's legacy. And thank you for allowing me to share her with you all. Um, Thank you for, I can't say thank you enough, right? Thank you for continuing to be the people who bring light into the lives of others. And I truly believe that when we choose connection over silence and compassion over judgment, hope over fear, that we don't just help people heal, we help save lives. So thank you again.
Thank you, Michelle, for your presentation and sharing your precious journey. If you like, take a gentle breath together as we reflect on this heartwarming story with resilience. And I would like to send my care, appreciation, and compassion through the screen to you, Michelle. Thank you so much. We will be discuss more and answer questions from the audience after all the presentations. And if you have any questions for Michelle, please feel free to type them in the Q&A chat box now, and we will be reading through them together. Okay. Our next presenter is Dr. Chris Hahm. She is Associate Dean for Research at the Boston University School of Social Work and the first Asian American to be promoted to full professor at Boston University School of Social Work. Her work centers on health disparities, health risk behaviors, and mental health, with particular in epidemiology. theory development, and suicide prevention among Asian Americans and US young adults. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, NPR, the Washington Post, and The Economist. Please join me welcome Dr. Hahm.
Thank you, Cruz, so much. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about our research study. It's called HEAL, and the HEAL study focuses on Asian American family suicide survivors. Michelle articulated so much, so well, so beautifully about what it means to be living as a survivor. So my study today, my presentation today for 20 minutes is going to be focusing on that. Now, first, I would like to acknowledge the family's suicide survivors, including Michelle. They taught us about the death, but they really taught us about the life and living and strength, and really importantly, what it means to be a human being. And I learn from you every day, and so thank you. Also, before we go on, I would like to acknowledge that we have so many collaborators for our study. We have researchers, including our third speaker, Brian Keum, and my doctoral student, Jinwon Lee, Martha Thompson, Pata, and we have a BU Tufts, Berkeley, UCSF students who are all joining our study. So thank you to Matthew, Amelia, Emily, David, Julia, Vivian, Eileen. So Michelle talked about in the beginning that, suicide doesn't affect just one person or several people. Suicide affects many people, the entire family members and their co-workers, the school, the community. It could be more than 100. And they go through so many different challenges, psychological challenges, complicated grief, PTSD, a lot of emotional struggles. So, suicide may be the end of one person's life, but it is a beginning of a struggling life and challenging life for so many people who are left behind. And what's really striking to me is this, that I've been studying suicide behaviors and suicide ideations, particularly among Asian American families. And the more that I study on the topic of suicide, I realize that just like what Michelle said, the most important prevention for the suicide should be studying survivors. Okay, family survivors. But so I was looking into that to understand, how Asian American family survivors are doing. And I was so shocked to find that there has been not even one study documented and do the systematic studies on Asian American family survivors. So I decided to do it. And then there was one day, it was a really rainy day. It was a crazy rainy day. And I knew about Brian Keum. He was actually at Boston College, was working at Boston College. I'm working at Boston University. I actually went to his office on a very rainy day and I pitched my study and I asked him to become a co-investigator for this study, and he agreed. And we have received funding from American Foundation of Suicide Prevention. And next month is going to be our first year of end of the study. This is a relatively small study, but very meaningful, and 2 years study. So the one that I'm going to talk about today is going to be the first year of our study. So it's HEAL, right? So HEAL represents hope and empowerment for Asian laws. Okay. So today, my promise is this. I am going to share our preliminary findings, And therefore, you are going to understand at the end of this 20 minutes, you're going to understand the salient and key concept of the HEAL study that we have discovered. And we've been working on developing the theoretical concepts, and I will share the theoretical framework that is also working theoretical concepts. Okay, so HEAL study has two phases. First, which I talked about, is a qualitative interview, and second is a quantitative survey. So for the qualitative interview, we proposed to the foundation that we are going to do 20 interviews, but it was, the study was going so well, so we were well exceeded 20, so we are now 31. We are going to continue to go to 40. And then next semester, which is going to be September, we are going to target the quantitative. So this is going to also double our recruitment subjects. And we originally proposed to have 75, but we are going to do 150 participants. So, we are actively recruiting. So, among your the audiences who's listening, who's watching our presentation, please let us know that you're interested in being a part of this study. So in order to be a part of this study, you need to be an Asian Americans. You can identify yourself as Asian Americans, and passing has to be done to be passed at least 1 year, and living in America, and at least 18 years old Asian Americans. Okay, so we use analytic strategy to analyze qualitative data, and we are using rapid qualitative analysis as well as thematic analysis. So I'm going to move on to result. So far, we have interviewed 31 qualitative interview. The interview goes about sometimes 1 hour, but on average, we have done 90 minutes, and sometimes it goes way beyond 2 hours. So we have interviewed 7 adult children who have lost their parents, and 10 parents who have lost their children, and substantially higher number of boys and sons have died among our samples. And we have interviewed 7 siblings as well as extended family members, aunts, uncles, and cousins. So my dog is banging the door, so let me just open the door for him. Hey, Cooper. Thank you. His name is Cooper. All right, so based on our analysis, we have discovered that interesting concepts have been merged. So we call it as a multiple rupture model of the suicide bereavement. What it is this. So these individuals, the family survivors, are going through 4 different levels of ruptures in their lives. So those are individual rupture, family rupture, social rupture, and cultural ruptures. So I'm going to go into this one in the detail one by one. So this is a mother who lost a daughter who was 18 years old. And she said everything was like before the event and after. Everything was broken. And she couldn't function for several years. And she mentioned brokenness in the interview several times. Her heart is broken, her life is broken, relationship is broken, everything was broken. So they go through this intrapsychic rupture, which is a very traumatic. So they are, dealing with fear, which Michelle talked about, lots of rumination and self-blame and guilt. It can persist for many years. And another thing that we have discovered is, I call it as the moment before the moment. They go back to the moment before the moment, what they could have done. They should have done differently. something might have happened to change the reality. So it's a lot of rumination, which is really very painful for them. So, they also go through this identity crisis as a let's say mother. I'm failed as a mother. I'm not that person anymore. Everything changed. Just like a BC and AD, Jesus Christ was born and now we say AD, right? Just like that, everything, the perspectives are starting from the day that deceased person, the person deceased. And loss of joy, that's another theme that we have found. The daughter was talking about the mother after the brother died. My mom goes through the motions. She goes to work and she is enough to survive. There's no joy in her life. You see. And then, I think there's something like, okay, this is a family rupture. Okay, let me go to the family rupture. Family rupture is a concept that family relationship is ruptured. We have seen after the suicide, there has been many parental divorce and separation. Sometimes divorce is a healthy thing to do. So the major the relationship changes are occurring. And as it says, here, the first one is a role changes. Sorry. So role changes because the brother suddenly died. The daughter, the sister, has become the sole caregiver for the parents. That she didn't expect that to happen. She's only 25 years old, but all of a sudden she has to assume the caregiver's role. And the later one is that my brother and his wife started having on each other, and instead of connecting, loving, helping, and so they end up divorcing. Social rupture. Social rupture is an aspect of their social life is being ruptured. So the mother who lost her daughter, she stopped going to the running group because she's a different person now, because I'm not the same person anymore. And several parents or several people mentioned to us that actually COVID was a blessing in the sky. Because of COVID, they didn't have to see anybody. They could be isolated and they're given a ticket to be isolated, and that's okay with them. And cultural rupture is a really fascinating concept. And this is really important concept that we cannot underestimate. So cultural rupture is not just rupture that they created or we are living in this breeding, okay? It's a culture of avoidance. We have found that the communication patterns of the survivors is a lot of conflict avoidance. Families avoid difficult topics before and after the death. And when you see this, maybe some of that avoidance was born into my son, that I struggle with avoiding painful and challenging things. Brian is also going to talk about the gender differences, but we also have discovered that the conflict avoidance was more common among the male survivors. And this one is a culture of silence. And, Misha talked about the fact that we have to break the silence. Silence is such a dangerous thing, and which is really true. But silence can be also used as a justified, because take a look at this. To protect my mom, her legacy, the way people speak about her and speak about our family, we've decided not to share how she passed. This is a Filipina, and she and her sister decided not to reveal the cause of death to the Filipino families in Philippines, her mom's families. And we also found that these families tend to have a lot of lack of emotional framework. They feel really uncomfortable talking about the mental health, and mental health concept is still raw and still unfamiliar. There's something that they really don't want to go into. Now, so those are the rupture systems, right? But then some of the really surprising thing for me is this. So I created this new framework. This is called rupture to transformation. Okay. And you can see at the bottom, there are different aspects of rupture: individual rupture, family rupture, social rupture, cultural rupture, right? But then along this, while they are struggling, day goes by and time passes and things are emerging. And they are having these healing mechanisms. Okay. So for Michelle, her family and her friends, she has 5 members who she can call anytime, right? So they develop these healing mechanisms. They could be friends, they're community members, or they could be religious group, church. Church have been playing a really major roles for these healing mechanisms. And psychotherapy, group psychotherapy, especially grief therapies. So they meet new people who have gone through similar losses. Another thing is a spiritual journey. One of our interviewees, she's a mother who lost a daughter. She actually communicates with the daughter, and she goes through this spiritual journey and to really have a relationship. And the really thing about this healing mechanism, the 4 things that I talked about, is the relationship building. They need to build a relationship. Once they do that, they are going into this post-traumatic growth, okay, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more. And if they are stuck in this rupture, if they cannot meet this, they cannot utilize this healing mechanism, then they are struggling. So we call it as a post-traumatic stagnation. However, those people who are going through this post-traumatic growth is going through this transformative self. So what's really amazing thing about the transformative self is this: the focus changes from me, my pain, my loss, to others, to mission, to purpose, the new purpose. Just like Michelle, she created the light, right? Loss to light, and transforming pain into purpose and the greater service. That is one of the most beautiful and amazing thing that we have discovered. And this post-traumatic growth group, when you see it, they radically face the stigma of suicide from the beginning. And they are active in receiving treatment. They maintain or they develop even greater social network. And they develop this compassion that they didn't necessarily have, or they had it before, but they are much more intentional about showing compassion, actively working on the compassion for themselves and then others. However, post-traumatic stagnation group, on the other hand, is suffering from the rumination, and silence and secrecy has been prevalent, and the avoidance and premature closure and emotional numbing. So I feel like one of the most important thing for the clinicians and the family networks that we need to do is this: people are ruptured, right? Multiple rupture, multiple aspects of the rupture. And then they need a healing mechanism. Okay, it could be religious group, it could be non-secular, secular group, it could be spiritual journey, or it could be psychotherapy. You must have this healing mechanism. Otherwise, you are going to be stagnated and you are remain or being, deteriorated by this power of rupture. Okay, so for the contribution of my talk today and our study is that this is the first study that describe and analyze Asian American survivors. We have developed salient theoretical construct, and then in the future, we are going to test the theoretical constructs. That's why we need to do the second phase of quantitative survey research that we are going to start from the September. And after that, we are going to develop the postvention, which means in the intervention for the survivors. That's what we are going to do. So my presentation is over.
Thank you, Dr. Hahm. So if the audience have any questions for the previous two speakers, there is like a Q&A function at the end, at the bottom of the screen. So we encourage you to type your questions now. And then as we introduce our last but not least presenter of today's webinar, whom Dr. Hahm is already mentioned about. So his name is Dr. Brian Keum. He is an associate professor in the Community Health Sciences Division at the University of California, Berkeley. His research aims to mitigate mental and behavioral health disparities by examining culturally informed, intersectional, and digitally relevant social determinants, integrating public health, counseling psychology, and technology. He also explores disparities in mental health services for minorities clients and culturally sensitive digital mental health platforms. Welcome, Dr. Keum.
Thank you so much. Let me just start my sharing. Okay. Yeah, so thanks again for having us for this webinar. It's been really just grateful hearing about Michelle and Chris's presentation. And then now I'm just trying to follow Chris's presentation to provide a little bit more about some of the results that are more focused on coping, growth, and then I'll be talking a little bit about a more systematic sort of conceptualization of an affirmation focused framework that could help with not just providing a safe and compassionate journey for survivors, but how that could also, as we've been saying, could be also reflected into more of a prevention purpose as well. So in terms of as we dive into sort of what Chris was saying there with the coping and then growth, there were some more specific themes of coping that's been coming up in our study. And so a lot of it actually Michelle has already sort of talked about it in her story and others as well. And this culture of silence has been coming up very frequently in our data. And it's something that I think, if you grew up in the Asian American or the immigrant community, this is not something that is uncommon, right? This is actually, as Michelle said it perfectly, sometimes you grow up thinking that silence is the way to handle issues, not just mental health issues or suicide issues, but even just life difficulties that some of our youth go through. They think that just being silent and not doing anything about it or just working harder could be something to solve that problem. And so a lot of those things were intertwined into, as we studied about suicide loss, obviously a lot of conflict avoidance, stigmatization, shame, and embarrassment was all associated with this. And some of how the silence kind of looked like, you can kind of take a minute to read the quotes that I've listed here. But they really tell, telling story, right? About how deeply profound that they had to be with their silence to sort of, work through their pain, suffering, and trying to have any sense of control over this process. And so it's been sort of a really heart-wrenching, thing to hear about from the survivors because it feels really lonely for them. And sometimes they feel like there is no help available, right? And so, and particularly with the silence, what was really particularly salient was the gender differences in that too. So as Chris already mentioned about this a little bit, the men in our study, they were more sort of pronounced with the silent response. So once the loss had occurred, a lot of men would actually engage in a lot of silence. And of course, the silence looked also different. So some of them would be just, of course, verbally silent. Some of them would just be emotionally restricted. They would not share any of their emotions. Some of them just, channeled all their energy into working. So not doing anything else, but just focusing on work, being productive as a way to sort of, channel their silence that way. And so you can kind of see that, as Michelle talked about before with the emotional responses, they were also showing a lot of different forms of emotions that are not just about sadness, or feeling unhappy or unpleasant. There was a lot of guilt, anger, and then there were endless questions of why, right? So why I did really want to find an answer, right? So it's almost like problem solving. And so really trying to see it as a problem that needs to be solved. And so, and of course, as we saw, it was an ebb and flow of just one day thinking that they, found an answer, but then the other day they're like, wait, this is not it. I don't know what's going on, right? So it's this back and forth process of just feeling just no, not just lost, right? And being sort of internalizing all of those emotions and pain. And so these are actually some quotes and excerpts from another study that I've done before. And this is actually particularly just for Asian men. And so these are some of the quotes from the participants that we interviewed about how they handle, issues in their life, cultural difficulties, including discrimination, family issues, issues in their work. And most of them talk about how it's really hard for them to, have any good coping skills because the way that they've been socialized in their communities and the society, it just does not give them the tools or the space to be able to develop those things naturally. And so they were facing that and externally, and then internally, there were barriers and lack of support, which was like a toxic combination that a lot of men were talking about. So when they were actually asked to really share about how you cope with issues, they just did not know how to do it, right? So when you now situate that within a mental health issue, you can see how that can snowball. And so a lot of men, what we kind of saw was that there's a lot of silent suffering and there's a lot of internalized self-negativity. And a lot of that, and you can see how this can really increase the risk of feeling like, I'm a problem to be solved is an actual phrase that they say. I'm a deficit. It's a deficit on top of a deficit. It's almost like, going down the rabbit hole of just not being able to handle the issue. And so at the end of the day, they start to blame themselves and just it's a never-ending cycle of that. So a lot of the with the silence and then the grief expression, one thing that we kind of saw as well is that there's a lot of belief that systems that formed, and especially a lot of the questions about why, feeling like they're failure, right? Since the loss of their family member to suicide. A lot of participants talked about just that they wanted to just sit in the fact that they might be a failure, right? To their parent, to their friend, the spouse and partner, the sons and daughters, and especially to themselves as well. So, and then largely failure as a member of the community and society. So all these failure, belief systems were really apparent. And a lot of that had to also do with the fact that, prior to the loss, a lot of families also had a lot of norms, right? And our norms in our community, if you think about the immigrant community, especially, right, there is this norm to be, a lot of them come for the American dream, so to speak. A lot of them try to achieve, right, and become a successful family in the immigrant communities. There's a lot of achievement-based norms that our members work with. And so a devastating loss like this can really derail, right, what they thought was their process of being present in this country. And now they're, left to just think about, well, what's happening now, right, with myself, my family, what are we doing here, right? So that's been sort of an apparent story that we've seen. And one of the things that I do want to kind of start to gear on though is that while that was part of the journey for a lot of families, as Chris mentioned about there was the stagnation group and the growth group, we saw a sort of as time went by, that a lot of families, they acknowledged what they lost, but then they were also acknowledging what was being rebuilt. So this sort of gradual process of rebuilding this growth. And so obviously in the initial immediately after the loss or several years after that, they were feeling like they lost a lot of, support. They were withdrawing. Friends and colleagues were kind of disappearing, they say. And in the grief groups, they weren't really able to find good, suicide-specific grief group support. But then over time, they were able to really sort of, develop more evolved social support that's more specific to their needs. They were able to find new friend groups, build intentional social networks that can help with the loss processing. And then some of them also took to social media to really process what they were going through and finding helpful space that way. And a lot of families were able to have consistent check-ins, not which are not just obligations, but also a space for them to continue to check in with how they are doing, in this journey. And so I think this was also something that Michelle also had mentioned. So the stagnation and growth, and as time went by, we saw them to be very much of a duality. So it's not something where stagnation ends at one point and growth begins. It was sort of a back and forth process, and it's just something that a lot of participants said, yeah, I just, each day I take it day by day, and then I just see what's going on that day and what triggers me or what sorts of reactions I might have based on what's going on in my life. And it's sort of a, dual process that they kind of manage. And so the growth, going through that process, a lot of participants mentioned about how these kinds of factors are really helpful for them. And so a lot of them actually became advocates. So we even had participants who became advocates for AFSP, the foundation that had granted us the grant, right? And so they became advocates for that. They were able to go into the community, go to rallies, go to gatherings, and be able to really develop their new community network that way. And then they were also turning their grief into meaningful work, right? A lot of involved grief, that's through social support building, in which they had to sort of really rally to develop those new social connections. A lot of self-compassion, and then spiritual continuity as well. And so Chris had already mentioned this, that's, the ability to create that meaning and purpose through spiritual sort of spirituality or religious, connections were really important for a lot of the participants. And so some of the quotes that we have about just how the meaning making has been going on, right? So we have folks who are able to create meaning in the ways that they would like. And these quotes really represent how they've been doing it. Grief is just love with nowhere to go. I don't care what people think. My son needs help. Let's get him help. And that's the meaning that this father continued to attach even after the loss. We have to survive, right? We have to move on. We have to keep going. We can help one family, one person. We know that is what he would want us to do. So really turning that loss into a purposeful meaning that can also work to protect and, help other families who are troubled similarly. So with all of that going on, however, so one thing that I would like to emphasize is that all of those processes, we see that it doesn't just happen because only the individual and the families are building it, right? It happens, and I think that Michelle and Chris had already said this too, is that it happens as a societal process. It's not just something that happens individually and family-wise. And so what can the community do, right? What can our communities, the immigrant community, the Asian American communities, what can they all do? And, if you think about just how silent we are, right, around these issues, how much we don't talk about it, we don't have the space. I mean, even just having this webinar today is a very grateful experience because we are here validating these issues together, right? And so that kind of affirmation, right, being seen, like being valued and validated for what you're going through. And it's not just about, adding on to the healing. It can be a framework that can be centralized into the ways we think about community support. So there are, and when we think about affirmation in the academic context, there is obviously micro affirmation, which is more like everyday, daily interactions that you could have, like something positive that a stranger had said to you on a pass by, right? That still makes you feel seen, right? And then there's macro affirmations, which is just more larger systemic or policies that can actually be seeped into many different support systems, community levels, that can sort of act as now a more affirming societal building. And so there's real power, right, in terms of how much we can affirm each other, how much we can check in, how much we can provide compassion, but it just isn't something that we think about intentionally about how it can be built into the ways that we support, suicide loss survivors, and then of course the families who are experiencing not just that, but also mental health issues. I mean, how can that process itself can then be a pathway toward prevention, right? As Michelle said, it's not just that, there's an end to this issue, or we can only be reactive. There are roots to these issues, and if you think about just the socialization, and then of course the framework around how we think about the immigration process or the Asian American community norms, it's got to be something that is more systemic, right? So as much as in terms of affirmation, a lot of evidence does suggest that it does buffer suicide ideation. Here's a study that we did with Asian American men. And affirmative body positive and positive intimacy experiences actually buffered suicide ideation that was associated with experiences of discrimination. And so, and then we have another a paper or a study that we did where we were able to identify different domains of affirming experiences, and which actually helped lower a lot of mental health issues, promote flourishing. And so I'll share a little bit about that here. And this is just the different levels of affirmation that one can sort of maybe experience as they go through different levels in their community. So, as an individual, you could have interpersonal affirmation, family and peer networks, community institutions, and then culture and society. And so, there are these 10 domains of affirmation that you could experience. And of course, there could be more, but it's just that these were the ones that showed up in the study that we did. And so here are the 10 domains that I present. And all of these are domains where you just not only receive affirmation, but also domains where you can provide affirmation. So what the beauty of affirmation is that it's reciprocal. So there is also power in that reciprocal affirmation, which is what really helps the community building and connection in that way. In terms of just simplifying some of the results here, so in the study we recently did with about 1,000 participants, we were able to see three different groups who are experiencing affirmation. So one group was very low; they rarely experienced it, and then there was a group that was moderately experiencing this in certain domains, not all domains. And then the class three is a group that received the most affirmation. And then when we looked at their differences in terms of how they're doing, you can see that, yeah, the group three had the lowest depressive symptoms, lowest suicide ideation, most positive mental health reports, lowest loneliness, lowest internalized racism. And then continuing on with more of those indicators, more critical sort of awareness about their ethnic and Asian American identity, greater community connection, greater consciousness about who they are in the context of the US, and then greater resilience, greater emotional self-efficacy, and then even more skills for daily coping. And so what that really told us is that, wow, like, if you're able to, if we're able to really have a community that really centers affirmation, being seen, valued, and validated into many different layers of how we interact with our community on a daily basis, even if it's one just gesture a day, or even something that you saw at a community center, or even something that you did, or some kind of policy that you just saw, that can make a lot of difference, right? Especially for families who are going through trauma, suicide, loss. And so that is that there is a lot of power in that I think we're sort of, that could be explored. And so, if we think about even culture of silence, right, and the risk that it creates in terms of hidden suicide ideation or even delayed help seeking, we can normalize the conversation, right? And that could be the starting place to do that. If we have family estrangement and role shift, the rupture that we saw that Chris had explained, and you start to feel isolated, well, there could be some community mentors, emotional connection that can be provided outside the immediate family that can sort of help support that process too. So just going through some of the few examples here, given the time constraint, but if you're able to prioritize affirmation across the community, not only will it help provide, right, a more systemic, safe, compassionate space and journey for the suicide loss survivor families, but it's bigger than that, right? It's because it's also about our mental health overall. And so then how does that sort of then translate into prevention or postvention, this interaction? I think that would be very important for us to consider. And so for families, really just, reflecting that principle in there, checkpoints, making space that validates and, really helps families, check in with each other about how things are going. For clinicians, you could really, think about helping families or individuals. Where do you get your source, affirming messages, not just the presence, but how does that sort of affect you as you think about your post-suicide loss experience and journey? And how does that affect your day-to-day basis? Where do you actually feel seen? And for community organizations, there could be some more, affirmation-driven sort of events, peer support groups, and even media that could actually help, turn the tide on these issues. And then, of course, for survivors themselves, really practicing, self-affirmation, right, self-compassion, and that could also translate to many other layers of the domains that we talked about. So this is again just one way to just think about how could communities as a whole, right, mobilize or be present or be listening or be conversating about this issue in a way that really affirms without really trying to and without sort of being judgmental or not to stigmatize them further, but ways for the community to stand tall in this issue as well. So I hope that you found that helpful, but that is the end of my presentation. And so I will turn it over to Cruz.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. So now we will have around 15 minutes for the Q&A. So may I invite Michelle and also Chris to turn on your camera? And yeah, there is one audience asked about if there will be any reference for the slides. And I also want to just mention that like all the slides and the recording of this webinar will be posted on our Lotus project website within 1 to 2 weeks, and you will be getting a notification through your email. Can you all also read the questions in the Q&A function, three of you? So there is like one specific questions that we have a vote from Andrea. So the first questions that I would want to ask you is like, are there studies or recommended approaches for engaging AAPI families in ways that culturally strengthen early conversations about mental health and improve access to services before a crisis occurs? Like, so it's like more like prevention. Any recommended approaches that you found in your research? Maybe anyone of you want to share?
You want to go, Brian?
Yeah, so I mean I can get us started and maybe you all can chime in. I mean I think the question dovetails a lot with the presentation I just made about the how do we have these conversations in community in a more affirming and validating way. And so I think the conversation has to happen at many different levels. But for as a person who, I mean, in the study that we did, we actually heard a lot from participants that their therapists were not helpful. And that's because they were not actually, and maybe I don't know if it was lack of training or just their own personal sort of issue with dealing with suicide issues, is that they felt stigmatized. They felt like the therapist didn't know how to handle the conversation. They were trying to fix the problem rather than just listening and being present. And so, and I was trained as a therapist myself, and so I totally understand, what how difficult that conversation can be. But I think that's sort of where it all starts, is that just acknowledging the fact that this is an issue that is obviously going to be difficult. But everyday check-ins, as I talked about in the presentation, doesn't have to be about just suicide, but just start somewhere, right? Because if you just sit down and say, let's talk about suicide, I'm pretty sure, it's not gonna just go into that kind of conversation or launch into that conversation. Another thing about the silence too is that what we saw was that a lot of families and parents thought that everything was okay about their children. Every time they were saying, oh, they're doing well in school, doing well in sports, all this, everything is fine and dandy, right? But I think that is actually the time when you check in. I think that, us as in our communities, including my experience growing up in the immigrant community, when somebody says it's all fine, we just move on from that. And I think that that is actually when we actually have to step in and actually talk about, okay, well, what's really, just tell me more about like your day-to-day experiences, what's actually happening, how are you feeling, and all these things. And so, I would say that that is just, being able to find that starting point would be a really great place to start. And so then I'll just, pass it to Chris or Michelle.
Yeah, I want to continue on what Brian just talked about. Like parents thought that their children were okay. So, in other words, they couldn't really know, they didn't really identify any kind of symptoms or clues or signs that people talk about, right? Before the suicide. So, I feel like out of 31 um, research participants that we analyzed, I can say we have like three different groups. Okay. We have to look into them more carefully, but you know, the one group is just the group that Brian talked about, hidden ideation. The family were completely shocked. They were doing very well. They were great students. They might have been depressed, but they were just starting to have some medication or they were in psychotherapy. They were not complaining so much. But the next day, they were found dead. These groups, particularly, many of them were male, young. I'm talking about teens or early 20s. Okay, so that's one group. The other group was much more the risk was kind of sensed among the family members. So they are the ones who have been suffering from mental illness for a long time, like depression or severe anxiety or bipolar disorder or severe mental health problems, schizophrenia, and so forth. And those group of individuals, families are all wary about them and they are worried and in and out of the hospitals. And then, they die by suicide. Another group, which is very rare, kind of rare, most rare, is that um, you know, the individual has a disability or, like autism, okay? And families know that, but this autism has been going on for a long time and the individual suffers for a long time. But because of the communication difficulties, the family members sometimes ignore or they try not to know about them, because it's been going on for a long time. So that member of the family, individual, becomes isolated. But that becomes a norm within the families, right? Becomes a norm because the person doesn't really speak, doesn't express, but then they may drink a lot. But it's a way of, he just does that because he's lonely, right? But then families just accept that. And then the person dies, and then everybody just realizes, oh my God, that we could have done something. You see, so there are some differences beginning to emerge.
Yeah, just to kind of piggyback off of that, I think when you talk about these signs, to me, there are no signs because even my daughter, like, she was happy as can be, she was the life of the party. And, the next day, we got the call. So there are no signs, but I would say just in general, be curious. Like, ask detailed questions, not like, how are you doing? Because, of course, everyone is automatically like programmed to say, I'm fine, even though they're not fine. I mean, you could ask questions like, "Oh, did you get that car yesterday? Or did you look at that car? I remember you talking about this car that you love." Like, ask like more detailed questions that are more leading. I feel like when you do that, you kind of open up a conversation because even for me, sometimes like I do want to talk about how bad I'm feeling, but like, how am I going to say, "Oh my God, I feel bad?" Like if they say, "Oh, you know what? Did you try that? Did you try this food? Wasn't it awful?" Like they just ask like really leading questions, like detailed questions. If you remember what you guys talked about last time, maybe like a continuation of that, like just be curious. And I'm telling you, like the conversations will totally flow. I also put another note in here, like for checkups, right? So we always go to our, primary care doctor for physical checkups, but like, do we schedule any checkups with our friend groups? So for me, I know that I've tried to schedule normal checkups with my friend groups, like once a week. It's a quick text. Hey, just checking in. What's going on? Or did you get that job? Or like, did you get that whatever, right? Did you try this new restaurant? Like just things like that. Like it could be one sentence and it could mean everything. So I think those are certain ways to kind of like check in, really, instead of just saying, how are you doing? Because there's always that basic answer.
Mm.
Yes, like some of the symptoms are really like invisible and non-verbal. Yeah. And I think like if we can like observe that we have a close relationship with the person and if we observe something different, maybe we can just verbalize like, hey, I see something different, but in a general way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have 1 more minute. Maybe we can answer one questions. So for AAPI families who experience the loss of a loved one to suicide, and are there notable differences in the emotional or cultural impacts compared to losses from like other causes? Like, yeah, any insights?
I can go. I think what we are noticing is that, like Brian and I, we are the therapists, obviously, and also we are researchers. So we've been treating Asian American family members for many years. So we know, like, because we also do the research, we know, stigma is a big issue. Mental health, people don't talk about it. So we know those kind of things. However, it was really amazing to hear each family members to talk about how much they are not talking about mental health within the family members. It was a one after the other. It's it doesn't matter whether they are first generation, second generation, third generation. And it was particularly more pronounced among the male participants, or when wife starts describing the husband, okay, or the daughters are describing the fathers, the reaction to suicide, or even before that. So I think this cultural rupture is just so pronounced among Asian American family members, more than what we had imagined or understood. Therefore, the culture is active. It's not just a barrier. It's an active driver for harms, not harm, Chris Harm, okay? So really important to understand this cultural barrier, which also means that we're going to have to target this cultural barrier as an active, trying to mitigate, to take an action, to really do something about it. That should be the next level of treatment.
Thank you, Chris. for your response. I noticed the time, and I want to really appreciate three of you again, your time and also your presentations. And I see there's some questions still on the Q&A chat, and we may not have enough time to answer them, but maybe we can also copy the questions, and maybe you can answer after the webinar. And thank you again. And I also want to thank you all the participants for your compassion and commitment to supporting those in moments of greatest need. We wish you continued strength and care as you return to your important work.